Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of neurons.
The building blocks of our brains.
Exactly. We had a listener write in, and they basically wanted us to, lay it all out, all the key theories, the concepts, all the research and all that stuff.
Oh, the juicy details.
Yeah, so we figured, why not take a deep dive into the amazing world of neurons?
Let's do it.
All right, so to kick things off, let's talk about, what makes a neuron special. I mean, they're cells, right?
Yeah, they are cells, but they're not just any cells.
Right, they have these crazy abilities.
They have these unique features that allow them to receive and transmit information and process it.
So it's like a super highway of information in our brains.
Exactly, a very complex communication network.
Okay, so for someone who's, never heard of a neuron before, how would you break it down, like Neuron 101?
So imagine a neuron. It's kind of like a tree in a way. It has these branches called dendrites, and those dendrites are constantly receiving information from other neurons.
So they're like the listeners, the information gatherers.
Exactly. And then that information travels down this long cable-like structure called the axon.
Okay, and the axon's like the messenger.
Yeah, you can think of it like a highway carrying information to other neurons or even muscles and glands in your body.
So it's like a relay race. The dendrites get the message and the axon carries it to the next neuron.
Exactly. And at the end of the axon, we have what's called the axon terminal.
Okay, what happens there?
That's where the electrical signal is converted into a chemical signal.
Whoa. Hold on, electrical and chemical signals. This is where I start to get lost.
It sounds complicated, but it's not too bad. Think of the electrical signal as the fast-moving current in a power grid.
Okay, I got that.
And the chemical signal is like a courier delivering messages between buildings.
Okay, so the electrical signal goes down the axon, and then it gets turned into a chemical signal at the axon terminal.
Right, and then that chemical signal is used to communicate with the next neuron.
Okay, so how does that actually work? How does one neuron talk to another neuron using this chemical signal?
So at the axon terminal, the electrical signal triggers the release of these special molecules called neurotransmitters.
Neuro what?
Neurotransmitters. They're like the words in the brain's vocabulary.
Oh, so each neurotransmitter has a different meaning.
Exactly. And they carry different messages across the gap between neurons. We call that gap the synapse.
Okay, so the neurotransmitters are like the couriers carrying the message across the synapse.
Precisely. Some of these couriers or neurotransmitters are excitatory.
Excitatory.
Yeah, they tell the next neuron to fire to pass the message along.
Okay, so like a green light.
Exactly. And then you have other neurotransmitters which are inhibitory.
So those are like red lights.
Yeah, they tell the next neuron to hold back, not to fire.
So it's like a constant balancing act between go and stop signals.
Absolutely. And if this balance gets disrupted, you can have problems.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, too much excitation can lead to seizures, for example.
Oh, wow.
And too much inhibition could lead to sluggishness or even coma.
That's crazy. I never realized how important that balance is.
It's crucial. And what's really fascinating is that these signals aren't just one size fits all.
What do you mean?
I mean, the strength and the timing of the signals also so matter. It's like the brain is having a nuanced conversation.
Not just yelling simple commands.
Right.
This is already blowing my mind. But how do scientists even study these tiny processes? It seems impossible.
It's definitely challenging, but researchers have developed some amazing tools.
Like what?
Well, one common method is to use tiny electrodes that are much thinner than a human hair.
Whoa.
They can record the electrical activity of individual neurons.
So they can actually listen in on these neuron conversations.
You could say that. And by using arrays of these electrodes, we can monitor the activity of multiple neurons at once.
That's amazing. So we can see how different parts of the brain work together?
Precisely. It's like mapping out the brain's own social network.
This is incredible. We've talked about how neurons send messages and how scientists study them. But what about these other cells? I always hear about glial cells. What are they all about?
Ah, glial cells. They're often overlooked, but they're essential.
Yeah, what do they actually do?
They play a crucial role in supporting the neurons and keeping the brain environment healthy.
So they're like the unsung heroes of the brain.
Exactly. They're working behind the scenes, making sure everything runs smoothly.
So neurons get all the attention, but they wouldn't function without glial cells.
That's right. And there are actually different types of glial cells, each with its own job.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for instance, you have astrocytes. They help regulate the chemical environment of the brain.
Okay.
And then you have oligodendrocytes.
Oligo what?
Oligodendrocytes. They form the myelin sheath.
The what?
The myelin sheath. It's a fatty insulation that helps speed up the transmission of signals along the axon.
So it's like the insulation on a wire.
Exactly. It makes the signal travel faster and more efficiently.
Wow, so it really is a team effort. Neurons might be the stars, but they need their supporting cast.
Absolutely. And this intricate interplay between neurons and glial cells is what allows our brains to do all the amazing things they do.
From thinking and feeling to moving and creating.
Exactly.
This is already so much more complex than I ever imagined. but my brain needs a little break to process all this incredible information.
I hear you.
We'll be back soon to delve even deeper into the world of neural communication and explore those different types of signals that neurons use.
Stay tuned. It's going to get even more interesting.
We'll be right back after a quick break. All right, so we're back and we've been talking all about the amazing world of neurons.
These tiny cells that make up our brains.
Right, and before the break, we were talking about glial cells and how they support neurons.
Yeah, they're like the unsung heroes of the brain.
Totally. But now I want to go back to those electrical signals we talked about earlier.
Okay.
You mentioned that neurons use electricity for both communication and computation.
Right.
But how does a neuron actually compute something? That's always been a mystery to me.
Well, it all comes down to the interplay between those excitatory and inhibitory signals.
The green lights and the red lights.
Exactly. At any given moment, a neuron is receiving thousands of signals from other neurons. Some are saying fire, and some are saying don't fire.
So it's like a constant barrage of information.
Right, and the neuron has to weigh all those inputs and make a decision.
To fire or not to fire, that is the question.
Exactly, and the way it makes that decision is by basically adding up all the excitatory inputs and subtracting all the inhibitory inputs.
Like a tiny calculator.
Yeah, and if the sum of those inputs reaches a certain threshold, the neuron fires an action potential.
So it's like a tipping point.
Precisely. And this process of integrating information and making decisions is happening all the time in billions of neurons throughout your brain.
Wow, so it's not just about transmitting signals, it's about processing them, making sense of them.
Exactly. And that's what allows you to think and feel and experience the world around you.
That's incredible. So let's talk more about those neurotransmitters. You mentioned glutamate and GABA, but I know there are many others.
Oh, yeah, there's a whole cast of characters in the world of neurotransmitters.
Like, what are some of the other key players in this chemical language of the brain?
Well, you've got dopamine, for example.
Dopamine, I've heard of that one.
It's often called the feel-good chemical because it plays a crucial role in reward and motivation.
Ah, so that's why we feel good when we do something pleasurable.
Exactly. When you experience something rewarding, your brain releases dopamine, and that reinforces the behavior, making you want to do it again.
So that explains a lot. What about other neurotransmitters?
Well, there's serotonin, which is involved in mood regulation, sleep, and appetite.
Okay.
And norepinephrine, which plays a role in alertness, stress response, and arousal.
Wow, so many different chemicals all working together to create our mental state.
It's amazing, isn't it? And each neurotransmitter system has its own unique set of pathways in the brain, connecting different regions and influencing different functions.
So it's an intricate network of roads and highways, all carrying different types of information.
That's a great way to think about it. And we're only just beginning to map out these pathways and understand how they all work together.
It's mind-boggling to think about the complexity of it all.
It really is, but that's what makes neuroscience so fascinating.
Absolutely. And speaking of fascinating, you mentioned earlier some cutting-edge techniques that scientists are using to study the brain.
Yeah, like optical imaging.
Optical imaging, what's that?
It's a way of visualizing the activity of neurons in real time using fluorescent dyes.
Fluorescent dyes, so the brain actually lights up.
It does. When a neuron fires, the dye responds by changing its brightness.
So scientists can literally see which neurons are active at any given moment.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that optical imaging can be done in living animals.
You mean like animals that are awake and moving around?
Yep. That means we can study neural activity in a more natural setting and see how the brain responds to real-world experiences.
So instead of just looking at brains in a dish, we can see how neurons fire as an animal explores its environment or interacts with other animals.
Exactly, and that's opening up a whole new world of possibilities for understanding how the brain works.
This is incredible. It sounds like optical imaging is revolutionizing neuroscience.
It really is, and these techniques are constantly evolving, becoming more sophisticated and powerful all the time.
Wow, it's like we're constantly zooming in, gets a clearer and more detailed view of the brain.
That's a great way to put it.
So what are some of the big discoveries that have come from optical imaging so far?
Oh, there are so many. We've learned a tremendous amount about how different brain regions communicate with each other, how neural circuits are organized, and how activity patterns change during different behaviors.
So we're starting to map out the brain's communication network, seeing which areas light up when we perform certain actions or experience specific emotions.
Exactly. And we're even starting to get a glimpse into the neural basis of consciousness using optical imaging to study how activity patterns change as animals transition between different states of awareness.
This is groundbreaking stuff. It feels like we're on the verge of some truly amazing discoveries about the brain and how it creates our minds.
I agree. The more we learn about neurons, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
It's both humbling and inspiring to think about.
It really is, and it highlights the importance of caring for our brains, both through lifestyle choices and through continued research to understand and treat neurological disorders.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the amazing world of neurons.
It's been a fascinating journey.
A huge thank you to our expert for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today. I feel like I've learned so much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring this incredible world. The brain is the most complex organ in the human body, and we've only just scratched the surface of understanding its mysteries.
Who knows what amazing discoveries await us in the future?
Absolutely. So keep those synapses firing and those dendrites branching out. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're on the last leg of our journey exploring neurons, and I gotta say, I'm still kind of blown away by how complex they are. It's amazing how such tiny cells can do so much.
It really is remarkable. The fact that these microscopic neurons working together create everything we think and feel and experience is just mind-boggling.
Totally. Before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to those optical imaging techniques you mentioned earlier. It sounds like something straight out of science fiction. Being able to actually see the brain in action.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? Imagine watching different parts of the brain light up as someone's like solving a math problem or listening to music or even experiencing an emotion. That's essentially what optical imaging lets us do.
Okay, so how does it actually work? What makes the brain light up like that?
Well, it all starts with these special fluorescent dyes that are sensitive to changes in neural activity. So when a neuron fires, these dyes change their fluorescence. They basically brighten or dim.
Interesting. So by shining light onto the brain and measuring those changes in fluorescence, you can see exactly which neurons are active.
Precisely. It's like having a window into the brain, watching the patterns of activity unfold in real time.
So it's not just about studying brains in a dish. We can see how neurons fire in a living, breathing animal.
Exactly. And not just any animal. We're talking about animals that are awake and behaving naturally.
Wow. So we can see how the brain reacts to real-world situations, like when an animal's exploring its environment or interacting with other animals.
That's right. It gives us a much more realistic picture of how the brain works in everyday life.
So it's like we're getting a glimpse into the brain's natural habitat.
Precisely. And this is opening up all sorts of new possibilities for research. For example, scientists can now study how neural activity changes as an animal learns a new skill, makes a decision, or experiences different emotions.
This is incredible. It sounds like optical imaging is a total game changer for neuroscience.
I would say so. And the best part is these techniques are constantly evolving. They're getting more sophisticated and powerful all the time.
So it's like we're zooming in further and further, getting a clearer and more detailed picture of the brain with each new advancement.
Exactly. And with each new discovery, we're gaining a deeper understanding of how the brain works and ultimately how we think, feel, and behave.
Wow. It's amazing to think about all the things we've learned about neurons just from this deep dive. We've covered their basic structure and function, those intricate communication pathways, and even the groundbreaking techniques that scientists are using to unlock the brain's secrets.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much more to learn.
I know. It's both humbling and inspiring to think about. It makes you realize how amazing and complex our brains really are.
It really does. And it makes you appreciate the importance of taking care of our brain health.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating world of neurons.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Likewise, a huge thank you to our expert for sharing your incredible knowledge and passion with us today.
The pleasure was all mine, and to our listeners, keep those synapses firing and never stop exploring the wonders of the brain.
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious,